Right, so our subject today is portrait retouching, and that's what we'll be concentrating on. This is a subject that, someone can talk about this for days and days and still not be done with it. And the great thing, I always say this, the great thing about Photoshop is that there's at least like 3 or 4 ways of doing one thing. And also the bad thing about Photoshop is that there's at least 3 or 4 ways of doing the same thing. So it could be really handy, depending on which one you find more comfortable, or it could be a bit confusing at times. Before I start, how many people here are actually doing photography? Like you take photographs? Okay, and how many people are taking photographs of other people? Okay, and what about the others? Do you work with Photoshop and on a daily basis? Do you do retouching? Yeah? Okay, great. The reason why I asked is if you are a photographer, it all starts at that stage. So you need to have a good foundation so that you can build something on it. So if you have a bad photograph to start with, I mean, you can change it, you can drastically change it, but the better the photograph in the first place, the better it will look once you apply your tricks and retouching in Photoshop or whatever other application you may be using. Sometimes later on I have another session on camera raw, which I won't go into now, but sometimes it's just enough to use a software like Adobe Camera Raw or Photoshop Lightroom without even touching Photoshop, if the photograph is okay to start with. If you do have a bad photograph though, you are already one step behind, so make sure if you are taking photographs yourself that you master that craft first before you get into retouching. If not, if you're just retouching, forget about what I just said, just concentrate on what I'll be telling next. The first thing you need to think about when you do retouching is what is it? Why are you retouching? What is it for? Is it going to be published on a magazine? Is it for the web? Is it a fashion shoot? Is it a natural portrait that you took of your kid, your brother, your mom, or whatever, that you just want to make it look better? Do you just want to make someone look a little bit younger? So you need to evaluate why you need to retouch. Sometimes you don't need to retouch. You just need to maybe. When I talk about retouch, by the way, I'm talking about getting rid of the blemishes, making it look a bit nicer with the color and tone. Sometimes you don't need that. Maybe you just need to crop sometimes, and that's all you need to do. Maybe you just need to straighten a crooked scan or a crooked photograph. So you need to know why you're doing it. And probably the second most important thing is to know when to stop. Because like I said with Photoshop, what you can do is endless. I mean, tell a good Photoshop user to do that, and they will do it. And tell them to do this, and they'll do it. And the more you can tell them, if they are able, the more they can do. And there's no limit to it. They say the sky is the limit, right? So you need to know when to stop. And we always say, the work is never finished. There's only a deadline you need to meet. So if you're doing this for someone, if you're just messing around, you can just work on it for like 5 days and still not be done with it. But if you're working for someone, for a client, they'll tell you that here's 10 photographs I want you to retouch, and get them back to me by the end of tomorrow morning. It's like, okay, so you need to make sure that you know what you're doing, and you need to concentrate on the on your watch as well. And these are really common sense. There are a couple of other things, but it's really important that you take breaks. Okay, so it'd be madness to just look at your screen for the next for like 2 hours non-stop. It will hurt your eyes. It will hurt your brain. You'll just want to die. You'll be like, enough, I don't want to see this anymore. So just take like short breaks, couple of minutes, 5 minutes, just look away, go watch something on the TV for 5 minutes, come back, make a phone call, just distract yourself from Photoshop. That will help. It will not only help you physically, it will help your brain as well. So you can come back and look at it with a different, from a different angle. Because what happens most of the times when you do retouching is you get drawn into it that much that you don't see anything else. And say, for example, you're concentrating on someone's eye, you just look at it for like 15 minutes, and all you see all around you is just one eye. So you need to take a step back and look at it again from a new perspective, and that's really, really crucial. And also, I teach on a daily basis for academic class. Almost every single class I do, I see people doing that. So they lean into the screen, right? They really look for detail. They just go for it like that. It's bad. As soon as you find yourself doing that, that's the time you need to zoom in a bit more, because there's the function, right? So you can sit back, relax, use your tablet or whatever you're using, mouse, whatever, ideally a tablet. Just zoom in more rather than just going really close to it. I mean, these are common sense stuff, but they will help you, and they'll help you live longer, hopefully, and have a better experience using Photoshop. Right, so how do we retouch? What do we do? What's the workflow? What's the process? Do we start from looking at the eyes first? Do we do the hair first? Do we do the color first? Do we crop first, or do we leave it for last? Well, this depends on who works. So it depends if you find it more comfortable, you work it in one way. I can work it in a different way. But ideally, what we do, I do photography myself as well, and a lot of retouch. Ideally, what we do is we first look at the overall light and the color and the tone, and for that we usually use a program like Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. Anyone used Lightroom before? Great, if you are. So we start off with Lightroom. If not Camera Raw, we use Camera Raw to set the overall tone and the contrast and enhance what we can globally. So the difference between using a program like Lightroom and Camera Raw and Photoshop is that the other two programs, or your camera's software, they do global adjustments mainly. So you change the overall contrast of the image. You look at the highlights of the image and you make them a little bit darker. You look at the shadows and you make them a bit brighter. So you change the overall image. And whenever you need to make some specific adjustments, like, I don't know, getting rid of some blemishes or making some major changes on the image, that's when you take it from that program into Photoshop. So ideally we do the enhancement, tonal enhancements first, then we take it into Photoshop, then we do the cleanup. So if, is there a cable in the background that you need to get rid of? Are there some spots on the model's face that you're trying to get rid of? I mean, I'm talking about portrait retouch, but this applies almost to any type of photography. So if you're doing landscape, again, change the overall color first, then get into the detail, and if there's like a lamp post that you want to remove, then do that in Photoshop. So first tonal enhancement and color, then you do the cleanups. Like I said, if you need to remove anything, then you do enhancements. So you can't enhance something before you clean it up, right? So it's like, if this room is full of rubbish, I can't just spray a couple of perfumes in here to make it nicer. I need to first get rid of that rubbish. Then I can make it smell nice by using the perfume. So you do that then. And the final thing is to look at it, take a step back. This is probably a good time to take a step back from your image, do something else, come back to it, and then do your final finishing touches. This could be the tonal enhancements again. So you can say, this image looks nice, but what if it was a bit more muted on the contrast side? Or what if it was a bit more vibrant? What if it was black and white? So then you come back at it and you do your final enhancements in Photoshop. Or you can take it back to Camera Raw and carry on editing it in Camera Raw. So, also one more word before I start. I know I'm talking a bit too much about this, but it is quite important, is that you need to get used to using keyboard shortcuts. Who's scared of keyboard shortcuts? Who thinks that they are, difficult to learn? Great. If you do, that's bad. Then they're not. Well, they could be difficult to learn because there are too many of them, but they're not difficult to learn. It's like learning ABC, So the more you use them, the easier they'll be to memorize. And I heard this guy talking about memorizing keyboard shortcuts once, and he used this analogy. He said, use the information on your left-hand side of the brain, but combine it with the right side of your brain. So left side of the brain, as you know, it does the mathematical stuff. So it's all logical stuff, or language you store in the on the left-hand side of your brain, and the right side is more for kind of creative stuff. So it's more for kind of say art and music and that kind of stuff. If you can combine it, and this guy was talking about his daughter learning ABC by the way of using a song, right? You go A, B, C, D, E, F. So that makes more sense to her, but it also teaches her ABC. So even if it's silly things, find ways to memorize stuff. Like there's this program called Final Cut. I don't know if you know it. And there was a shortcut in Final Cut which was F9, right? And what it did was to do an insert edit. That's a video editing program. It was an insert edit. And when I first learned it, I was like, was it F9 or F10? F9 or F10? I couldn't memorize it. Then I said, right, 9 looks like that, right? So it kind of inserts something. People think it's silly, but that's how I memorized it. So even if it does sound silly, find ways like this to memorize those shortcuts. They will help. Take my word for it. Anyway, back to Photoshop. First of all, before we do anything else, let's have a look at some of the major tools that you'd use for retouching a photograph. So I won't be doing it in the order that maybe you'll do it in a real-life situation. So I'll show you a couple of different tools. Some of the images that I have are already kind of enhanced in Camera Raw before I brought them here, so that we can save some time. So I'll start with this one. And if you are not using Bridge, do use Bridge. It's a really cool application, and it helps. It speeds up the process a lot. So I'm in Bridge here. I'll open up this image here, and first of all, as far as the retouch tools are concerned, painting tools are concerned, you're going to be most of the times working around somewhere around here in your toolbar, right? I'll quickly go over a few of these tools. We have the patch tool, and it's not about just using one tool, you know, when you retouch. It's about knowing which tool to use when and combining them in the right order. So we have the patch tool here, and what this does is it lets you select a large patch, as the name suggests, and you can replace that with something else. So it's like cloning, which we'll talk about in a second, but better. And it kind of blends it better as well. So say for example you want to get rid of this item here, you can just go ahead and create a selection, and this selection doesn't have to be created with the patch tool. So if you have a perfectly square shape, for example, you can use the rectangular marquee tool, hold down shift to create a square shape, then switch back to your patch tool and work on that selection. Or otherwise you just use the patch tool and it will create a freehand lasso selection. So you create the selection, and with the patch tool you just click, just drag it elsewhere. And it's important that here you find the, I don't know how easy it is to see that, it's quite visible. See that line there that the wall follows? You need to find things like that, like reference points like that, and make sure it lines up there as well. So I'm just dragging this there, and what I have underneath my mouse is being copied into the first selected area, right? So I can let go there, and it will take a while depending on the size of the image, and bang, it's gone. So that's a major change. It is almost invisible. Well, it's pretty invisible actually. I shouldn't say almost. It's gone. So it was before and after. So that's the patch tool. So for the large areas, we use the patch tool. If it's a smaller area, like say, I don't know, say this guy, you want to get rid of this guy here. By the way, I'm using a shortcut to zoom in and out to this image, and that's Command Spacebar. If you hold down Command Spacebar, I have two keyboards here, but ignore that. You can click, just drag it left to zoom out, drag it right to zoom in. And this is great because if you are using like Command Plus or Command Minus to zoom in and out, it's a pain. Then you need to kind of use the space bar to pan around this image. But with this keyboard shortcut, Command Spacebar, say for example I want to zoom into, say, this part of his head, I can just hold down Command Spacebar, zoom in there, do whatever I need to do there, Command Spacebar, zoom out again, zoom back into this part, zoom out again. It's a really handy keyboard shortcut, Command Spacebar. They will activate the zoom tool temporarily. And one more keyboard shortcut. If you're zoomed in like this, at higher than 100%, and your screen isn't big enough to show you all you have, if you hold down, this is a feature that not many people know or use, not many people that I know or use. If you hold down the H key, H for hand, it will switch. I didn't let go of my hand there. It will switch to your hand tool temporarily. If I click and hold it down, it will zoom out to what we call the bird's eye view, right? And I have a rectangle underneath my mouse there, and that's the same ratio as what I had before in the zoom level. So if I want to now zoom into this little camera, I can move it there, let go of my mouse first, then it will zoom back to that camera. So it's like using a loop. If you did any classic photography, you'd be using a loop to look around. It's like that, only a bit easier. Hold down H, click, move it around, let go, and it will zoom to that area. And Command 0 will zoom out so you can see everything. Now, if you didn't want to use the patch tool, but you wanted to use a brush to say get rid of a smaller part like this, you can select the spot healing brush, which is also a great tool, and you can simply paint away the parts that you didn't want to include in your image. So I'm going to zoom in there, and I'll resize my brush by the way of another really useful keyboard shortcut. So if you are using a Mac, this is Control, not Command, Control, Alt, click, and drag towards left. Get a smaller brush. This will work with every brush. So if it's the brush tool, if it's the spot healing brush, clone stamp, all the brush tools, this will work. So Control, Alt, click, drag left, drag right to make it larger. And on the PC, this is Alt and right click, then drag left and right. Okay. Then with this spot healing brush, you can simply paint away the parts that you didn't want to see. Wait for it, and they'll also disappear. Okay. So these two are quite important when it comes to retouching. And you also have the clone stamp tool, which is S on the keyboard, or this little guy here. Again, my brush is too large. I'm going to make it smaller. And by the way, with this keyboard shortcut, if you drag it up, you get a softer brush. Drag it down, you get a harder brush, and you get the preview here as well. This has been there since CS4, if I'm right. Okay. And with the clone stamp, almost always you want to use a soft edge brush. And the way this works is you hold down Alt, and you find a reference again, like this line. You don't just arbitrarily pick a place to clone from. So you find like a reference like this line again. You hold down Alt, you click to source from that point, then you move your cursor away, and you line it up, say with this. You click and drag up. What's happening there on the right hand side, I don't know if you can see right on that line there, there's a little plus sign. It's copying from that plus sign and it's pasting it into my brush there. Okay? And when it comes to using this tool, it's best not to dab the mouse, so not, you shouldn't go click, 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 because then you'll end up with patches, so that's a big giveaway when you use the clone stamp tool. So it's best, the fewer clicks you have, the better it will look, the smoother the transition will be. So that's the clone stamp tool there. Let me finish this up. Again, I'm sourcing from this line here, this crack on the wall, lining it up, and bang, it's gone. Okay. So those three tools are crucial: the clone stamp, healing brush, and the patch tool when it comes to retouching. Now let me open up Bridge again, and let's start with this image. I didn't want to use the portrait in the sense of like a studio portrait in all the examples, because it's not just that. So this is also a portrait photograph, as well as, say, this. This also is a portrait photograph, right? We'll be working on this one now. Now, I don't want to save anything. Now, most of the times, what we want to do when it comes to retouching is to reduce stuff rather than delete them. So, in this case, for example, I want to reduce the wrinkles on her face and maybe on his face, but I don't want to get rid of them, right? So they wouldn't not have wrinkles on their faces. That would just not look right. Before you do any retouching with these tools that I just showed you, except the patch tool, you need to create a new layer so that you work non-destructively. Okay, and you can do that either by clicking on this little icon here on the bottom right, or you can do this by the way of a keyboard shortcut, and that's Command-Shift-N, N for new, and that will create a new layer, and it will let you name the layer as you create it as well. And I'll name this layer Clean Up. Okay. Then I'm going to start with the healing brush, and this will look a little bit awkward first, but that's perfectly fine. That's what we normally do. We start and we make things look a bit awkward, so we exaggerate things. So if it's a color change, for example, we make it look really vibrant, then we dial it back down so that we can actually see what changes are appearing there. So using the spot healing brush, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of these wrinkles. And if this is the first time you're using this tool, you need to make sure that this button here is checked, where it says sample all layers, otherwise it won't work, because the layer I just created is empty. And so if this layer is empty, if I use this tool, it won't do anything because the layer doesn't have anything on it. So you need to make sure that this button is checked here, and also content aware should be checked, which it is by default, but just make sure. And make sure that you're always working on this cleanup layer, so you're not harming the original layer here. So I'm going to go ahead and quite quickly try and get rid of these wrinkles. So I'll make my brush slightly larger than the wrinkles that I want to remove, and I'll just go ahead and just paint over. And I do realize it looks a little bit awkward, but like I said, that's perfectly fine. And when you are reducing wrinkles like this or any blemishes, it's best to move the cursor, so draw the lines in the same direction as the wrinkles themselves actually appear. So rather than, say for example, this wrinkle here, rather than crossing that wrinkle like that, you should just go with it. So it tends to blend in better with the rest of the image there. So I'll go ahead and do these parts a bit quickly as well. And again, with this tool, rather than just clicking and drawing a long big line like that, it's best to just do that, bit by bit. And this line as well, maybe. Let me zoom out. Yeah, she looks a bit awkward. It's perfectly fine. Get rid of these as well. Maybe on her ear. Right, so we did make her look like she's different, I should say. Okay. Now, rather than leaving it obviously like this, what we almost always do is, because it's a separate layer now, I can come up here and drop the opacity of this layer down so it blends in with the wrinkles. So this is the layer that I just created, right, by using the spot healing brush. This is what I created on her face. If I turn this layer back on, and if I make this top layer a bit more transparent so I can see through that layer into the wrinkles, this is what that will look like. So probably the more money you get paid, the further you can drag the slider towards right, so the fewer wrinkles she has. But see the difference it makes? So I just set this up to like 60% there. Oh, you can't see that part of my screen. I set it up to about 60%. And if I turn it on and off, that's before and that's after. We didn't get rid of them, we just reduced them. Right? It's a really useful technique, this one, and you'll find yourself using it quite a lot if you are doing this type of work. Now, let's also, while we're at it, let's also go ahead and make her teeth a bit cleaner and whiter as well. I'm sure she'd appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and select the background layer, and I'm going to first go ahead and select the teeth so I can make a local adjustment on the teeth. In this case, make it a bit more bright. So I'm going to use the quick selection tool, which is W on the keyboard. I'm going to make my brush again a bit smaller, and I'm just going to go ahead and paint over the teeth so that it's selected. Just like anything else, it's not about knowing how to use the quick selection tool. It's about knowing how to use it and how to combine it with other tools as well. So right now I selected more than I needed to. So I'm quickly going to switch to my lasso tool, which is L on the keyboard, or it's this little guy. I'm going to hold down the Alt key to subtract from my selection, and I'll just go ahead and paint these parts because I didn't want these parts to be brighter, and maybe this inner part as well shouldn't be affected by this adjustment that I'll create. And I'll include this with the Shift key held down. That'll do the trick for now. Almost always when you create a selection, you want to refine the edges of that selection. So if I was to just go ahead and move this out, you'll see it's a little bit awkward, and the bits that I left out here are not so smooth, right? Instead, what you need to do once you create the selection is to come up either to the select menu and choose Refine Edge, or if you have one of the selection tools active, like the lasso tool, you can click on the Refine Edge button here, and it will isolate it. It does get a bit awkward, but it will isolate it. Then you can add things like, I won't get into this window now, but you can feather this so it's a bit softer, or you can shift the edge so it's not as large the area there. Then I'll hit OK. Now with that selection still active, I'm going to go ahead and hit Command J, Control J on the PC, and it will put that selected area from the layer that I had targeted onto a new layer. So it will create a new layer with this selection only. So Command J. Now I have the teeth, and I'll name that to be teeth on a separate layer, right? With that layer now, I can apply an adjustment layer to this, or I can go ahead and create an adjustment from the image menu. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'll go to Image, Adjustments, and Hue Saturation. What we always do when it comes to whitening teeth is that we first get rid of the yellows, because that's the dominant color on the teeth apart from white. So we go to the channel range here and we pick yellows. This will be a minor change, but you'll see what it does. So I picked yellows, and I'll desaturate yellows. So if I click and drag this towards left, it's quite tricky to see on that screen, but have a look. That's before, that's after. So it's a tiny change, but it does make a difference. So that's the first step. We desaturate the yellows. Then we go back to master, so it affects all the channels. And this is one of 2 times I use lightness. The other one is when I need to brighten the eyes. So I'll come down to lightness, just drag this, let me zoom out from this a little bit first. Just drag this towards right a little bit. And a tiny change here goes a long way. If I do that, then that will look a bit awkward. So you need to be careful with what you do there. So this was before, This is after. I think she'd be happy with that. So this is what it would look like all together before and after, just her face there. I didn't touch him. That's one. So let's look at a few others with more kind of close-up stuff or using a couple of different filters. So I'm going to go back to Bridge and let's go ahead and select. Let's start with this one. Right. This is another portrait, and this it's a stock image. It's not one of mine. I'll zoom in there. And this was a great technique I saw from someone else, but it works really fine. If you want to remove, I'm not concentrating on the face anymore. If you want to remove the kind of lint here, or any type of white bits or the black bits or things that are kind of standing out and they shouldn't be there, rather than, because there are hundreds of them, right? If you want to use the spot healing brush, it will take you forever to try and remove these. You can, but there's no point doing that. So what you could do instead is first go ahead and duplicate this layer, and you do that by selecting the layer first and hitting Command J. So if you have no selections active, that will duplicate the layer. If you have a selection active, that will put that selection onto a new layer. Command J, that will duplicate that layer. And I'll go ahead and create. Actually, no, I'll go ahead and create a selection on this using the quick selection tool. I'll just select the shirt. I'm holding down Alt to subtract, Shift to add. So I selected the shirt that I wanted to kind of clean up. Okay, I can always go to Refine Edge and make this look even nicer. So all these areas, I can tidy them up. I'll shift the edge towards left a little bit, and maybe I'll feather it a little bit as well. I mean, I'm not going to get into working non-destructively, and if you know that technique, you should always work non-destructively. So ideally, you turn this layer into a smart object first, and before you apply an effect, a filter, you'd apply that to a smart object as a smart filter, so you can change your mind at any time. But I won't get into that now, so I'll just show you quickly how this would work. So you create a selection, then you can use a filter which was intended to be used on scans, on actual scans, which is a noise filter, and it's called dust and scratches. So if you scanned a photograph and if you had scratches and dust, pieces of dust on that, you could use that. Okay. Now this will kind of blur them without losing that much detail. The way this works is, the way I like to work with this is I bring both of these values down to 0, go to radius, drag this up so it will start blurring things, and you should stop as soon as you see those little bits disappear. So somewhere about there they start disappearing. Then you go to threshold and you drag these towards right again just before you see those white bits start appearing again. Somewhere about here did the trick there. Let me zoom in a bit more. This was before, this is after. So it's thinking as if these are dust and scratches. That's another thing. Let's have a look at let's have a look at this image here. And while I'm working on this, if you're thinking that, hold on, that's not how I do it, that's perfectly fine. If you know your own way and if it gives you the same result, that's fine. Like I said, there's more than one way of doing something in Photoshop. So let's start with this. First of all, again, just working in Photoshop without going to camera raw or whatever, I'm going to reframe this. I'm going to change the crop, the framing of this by the way of using the crop tool. So I'll hit C to get my crop tool, and I'll do this arbitrarily. I'll just draw a crop box like this. And this is a great feature here, rule of thirds. So you'd be aiming to place the important stuff on these intersections. So maybe I'll make her look, say, that way. Make it a bit smaller, something like that. And I'll go ahead and double click so that it's cropped. Now, there's a great technique that I love using, and it gives this really silky, smooth feel to any photograph that you can think of. This works perfectly on landscapes, this works perfectly on portraits. This is what it is. So you select your layer, you duplicate it. And I'll call this Glow. Then with that layer duplicated, you turn that layer into a smart object so that you can change your mind at any time to make changes to this. So I'm going to right click on this and turn it into a smart object. Now with that smart object, I'll go to filter and I'll apply a blur effect. Any blur effect will work. If you like it to have a direction, you can choose the directional blur, the motion blur. If you like it to radiate out from the center, you can choose the radial blur. Just to keep it simple, I'm going to choose the Gaussian blur. I'll select it and I'll blur this quite a lot, let's say by that much. And because it's a smart filter, because it's a smart object, the filter we apply to it is a smart filter, which means you can now go ahead and change your mind. You can say, I don't want it to be this blurred, so you can double click on the Gaussian blur there, just change it. Okay. That's the beauty of using smart filters with smart objects. Now, right now it looks a bit stupid, right? We just blurred the whole image. But if you change this image, the mode of this image, the blending mode of this image from normal to something that will make this image blend with the sharp one underneath, you'll get a perfect result. So bear with me. If you click on this image, go to the blending mode option here, change it from normal. Let me zoom into this a bit so you can see what's going on. Change it from normal to one of these modes underneath overlay. So I'll start with overlay. Now, what that does is it looks at the top image, which is blurry, and it blends in the pixels of that with the sharper one. So it smooths everything out without losing detail, which is a weird concept. But let me zoom into her face, and you can actually see what it did. So this is with that layer, and this is without. Now, the more glow you want, so this is great for creating those kind of dreamy kind of images. The more glow you want, the more you can change it. So you can double click on that Gaussian blur. This is less. This is more. Can you see? It's almost like she's almost like glowing around, but she still has all the detail on her face and everywhere else in the image. That's the overlay. That's the overlay mode, and you should experiment with some of the others as well, like the soft light mode. And all of these have keyboard shortcuts. You can obviously click here and just select it. But if it's set to normal, for example, and you want to change the mode of this layer from whatever to soft light, you can do that by the way of a keyboard shortcut, and that's Alt, Shift, and F. So Alt, Shift, F will change the layers mode from normal to soft light. So if you care to remember that, that's a useful shortcut as well. And all of the others will give you different results. If you had the Move tool selected, which is this guy here, you can use Shift plus and Shift minus to toggle between the different blending modes of a layer. So I'm holding now Shift plus, and it's showing me the different modes for this, different blending modes for this layer. So I'm going to go back to soft light. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. What this does is it makes this whole image a little bit more saturated, and that's not necessarily what you had in mind, but what I had in mind. See, all the colors are a bit more vivid, so it's affecting the color as well, and I didn't want that. I just wanted the luminosity to change, but not the color. This is how we can get around that. See that problem there? I didn't mean it to be a color change, but it is affecting the color. So there's a great keyboard shortcut, and this shortcut is just a shortcut. It doesn't exist as a menu item anywhere, and that's called creating a stamp visible layer. What it does is whatever you can see there, if you use this keyboard shortcut, I'll tell you in a second, you create a new layer with what you can see on there. So it stamps all the visible layers and it creates a new layer without affecting anything else. And that's, does anyone know this?
I think it's Shift Command E.
Shift Command Alt E. So Command Shift Alt E. So it's all the modifier keys. So bash your hand on the modifier keys and E. They will create a new layer, and I can turn these off now, and I'll have this new layer. It's like compositing those onto a new layer, and I have almost like exported that layer out. That's called creating a stamp visible layer. The reason why I did that is because I wanted this effect to only have the effect on the luminosity, on the brightness, rather than the color. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and turn this glow effect, a glow layer, off. So I have these two now, this one and that one. And I'll change this layer 1's mode. Let me call this composite. I'll change this mode from normal this time to luminosity, which will tell Photoshop to only affect the luminance values, the brightness values of the image, and not the color. Let me zoom in. This was before, this is after. This time, you see, it doesn't affect the color. Obviously, it does a bit more contrast, so it looks a bit more darker. The darks look a bit darker, the brights look a bit brighter because it adds a bit contrast. But overall, it looks pretty nice. Right, one more thing I'll do to this image, and this shortcut I just told you is a really great way to kind of give a break. So you can say, add one more layer, add one more layer, and one more layer, and you'll end up with tens of layers. Then you can say tens of layers. Then you can say, okay, here's a break. Command Shift E, Command Alt Shift E. Then that's where you know that you kind of saved that work until that stage on a new layer. Then you can continue working on that layer. So what I'll do here is I'll go ahead and create a really rough selection to keep this quite simple and quick. So I'm going to use the quick selection tool. I'll just go ahead and select her. I'll tidy this up with the lasso tool on top of her head, something like that. That'll do the trick. And do you remember the shortcut to put her onto a new layer? Command J. Great. But before I do, actually, I'm going to hit Command Z. Before I do, I'm going to go ahead and refine this selection by clicking on the Refine Edge. I'll feather it. A bit more maybe, something like that. That will do the trick. I'll then hit Command J. So now she's on a new layer and she's feathered. And I have these weird things going on. That's because the layers mode is still set to luminosity. So I'm going to change that back to normal. There. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to click on this composite image, and this is one of my favorite filters. It's a blur filter, but it's not like a Gaussian blur or something. It's called a lens blur. So I'll click on filter. I'll change its mode from, so I'll go to filter, go to blur, and choose lens blur. Remember, this is the image underneath, so everything will be blurred, and that's fine because we have another image on top. The reason why I like this is because it doesn't just blur it. It uses this the highlights, the specular highlights here, and it creates those really nice shapes, like the iris shapes of the lens. Right. So I'm not going to get into this effect in all detail, but you can here change the radius of how big those are. Let me turn off the noise. You can change the radius of how big those speculars are and how much things are blurred. You can change the curvature of those blades. These are the blades. So you can have them a bit straighter. And you can change the specular highlights, so how bright the highlights are from the brightness. See, it changes the highlights. And you can change the threshold, so how much of the image is getting affected by this effect. So if I drag it towards light, you see more of those on the left hand side. I'm not too bothered about her, because I know that I have her on a new layer. So I don't care about what's happening here. I'll click OK. It will take some time to apply this. But once it's applied, because I have the other image on top, it should look pretty nice. There you go. Right. Now, this is before, this is after. Just for the sake of this, I'm going to change the mode of this to normal as well, so I don't have those little bits and bobs in the background. Now, if again this is a bit too much, which I think it is now, because it's a separate layer, and because I have another layer underneath it, I can go to opacity, just drag this down to blur this with the background. So you can create some almost surrealistic blurs with this as well. So this is how we started to this image. Zoom in there. And this is how we ended up. Right, so that's one more example of using the different blending modes. Right, so let's have a look at a few more images before we wrap up. What's the time? 1:45. You're doing fine with the time. Right, I'll show you one more, then we'll wrap it up there. So we have this image. Again, it's not one of mine, it's a stock image. And sometimes when you start a retouch work, like I said, when you need to do some major changes, like getting rid of the big stuff in the background, say for example the blemishes here or what have you, before you enhance it, you need to also keep an eye on the things that you can enhance when the time comes, right? So when you evaluate the image here, when I'm looking at it here, I'll go like, it's a bit too bright, right? It's like a highlight here is a bit too bright on his head, and you can change it. It's pretty simple to change, and you'll get this a lot, especially if you're using a portrait. If you're working on a portrait that's been shot in a studio, and if someone, if the makeup artist wasn't a great one, or if the lights were too hot, you'll get these specular highlights and you'll need to deal with them. And there's a good way of dealing with them, and there are a couple of different ways. One is you can actually create a selection around the area, which is what we'll do now. So I'll go to select, and the best way to select this area would be to use the color range option. So I'll go to select and choose color range, and I'll click on the area that I want to affect, which is this part here. Then I can just bring the fuzziness down a little bit so it just affects these parts. I'll click OK, maybe a bit more. I'll click OK. Now I have that there, and I'll go ahead and create a curves adjustment layer. Again, you can do this by the way of a couple of different ways, a couple of different tools. I'll go ahead and create a curves adjustment layer, which is this guy here. Because I had the selection active, when you create an adjustment layer, it creates a mask on that adjustment layer representing that selection. So which means whenever I make a change now, it will only be reflected on that selection. If I now go ahead and click and drag this down, it will only affect that area. Can you see it's just affecting that area? I know it looks a bit awkward now, but we'll fix that in a second. So we're just trying to blend it in with the rest there, maybe a tiny touch there. Then because it does look a bit awkward, I'm going to exaggerate this so that we can see what we can do with the mask. If you go ahead and in CS6, if you double click on the mask, yeah?
Could you use blend tool as well?
You can, yeah, by all means. If I double click on the mask, I can feather this. So it's not as bad, the change here. Can you see it's not all kind of little dots now? I can then click back on the curves, just drag this back up a little bit. So this was before, this is after. One more way that you can use, one more technique you can use to get rid of those hot spots is, this is the final one, is if you have an image like this and you have quite a lot of hot spots. So obviously this is not retouched, so you go ahead and retouch it first, so you get rid of all of these wrinkles that you wanted to, you tidy it up. And there's a really great filter called the selective color. Anyone use this before, selective color? It's great. Normally you use it for making adjustments on the color. So say for example, you want to change the blues in an image and you want them to have a bit more red in them, or cyan should be a bit more magenta or whatever. You use that filter normally. But in this case, I just found this by mistake. I'm sure someone else came up with this as well. But I was just messing about with that filter, and I was like, oh, let's try this, and it worked. And I was like, great. The way it works is it's either an adjustment layer, so it can be non-destructive if you want it to be. So it's this guy here, the selective color. Or you can go to image adjustments and selective color from here as well. It'll do the same thing. Obviously this will be destructive, so it will affect the original pixels and the other one won't. So from here you have the colors, right? So you can affect the red. So say for example you like the reds to be a bit more cyan, you can just drag it towards right, and her skin tone you'll see turns towards cyan a little bit because it has some reds as well as the other parts here. I'm going to hold down Alt and reset this. Instead of messing about with the colors, I'm going to go to whites being highlights, and I'll add a bit more black to white. So it will look at all of these parts, and it will make them a bit darker. Look at this. So I can't see it because the preview is not checked. Let's try again. Show you before. What's going on there? There we go. So this is before. So look at whites. So sorry, I'm dragging this towards the wrong direction. That's my brain going. This is probably the time I need to take a break, right? It's like a couple of moments, then we're done. I need to make the white a bit more black rather than making them a bit more white. So I'm going to click and drag this towards right. See what it does to whites? So this is before. Look at the highlights here. This is after. So it kind of evens them out. And this is again making an overall adjustment, right? So I'm not using the clone stamp or the spot healing brush or whatever. So it's looking at the entire image and making the highlights, the hot spots like here as well, a bit less obvious. And also using this technique, sometimes you can create some really cool effects like this. So you can make the whites even whiter. So this is exaggerating a little bit now. So I'm going to click on whites, go to black, drag it towards left. So whites are as white as they can be. Then you can go to blacks and make them darker. That's before and after, so the shadows become darker, so it's almost like adding contrast. Then you can go to neutrals. This is like, if you think of the levels adjustment, it's like the left slider, right slider, and the middle slider. The neutral is the medium slider. So with the neutrals, you can now make it brighter altogether, or a bit darker altogether. So you can create some really interesting effects with this selective color as well. And sometimes if you do a studio shoot, and if the background is like a black background, and when you shot it, it doesn't appear as black as you saw it with your eyes, you can use this, so create a selection around the background, and you can go to selective color and go to blacks and make them even darker, so you end up with pure black. So it's slightly tricky to see on that screen, but this isn't pure black, but now it is. And it adds this is a really fine look. I really like this look. It's like a muted, bit desaturated, and bit highly contrasted image. It's quite simple to create the selective color filter. And that will be the end of it. If you have any questions, fire away. If not, thanks for listening.